On the edge of the plains stood a ranch silent as a grave. Caleb Harrow lived there, a man of scars and silence, his only companions the wind and an empty chair. But one winter evening, a widow and her child came to his door with nothing but a trunk, a frayed shawl, and a plea for shelter. The town had turned them away. The world had already taken everything else. And when the little girl whispered, "Take me, mister, if you can't take both," the hardened rancher let them in, never knowing how storms, fire, and love would change them all. The land around the Harrow place had a way of carrying silence. Wind swept through dry grass, tugged at the barn siding, and rattled the loose panes of the ranch house windows, yet all of it only deepened the hush that lived there. Caleb Harrow had grown accustomed to that hush. It fit him, the way a worn coat fits a man's shoulders after too many years to count. His days began before light and ended long after it, measured in the scrape of the whetstone over his knife, the groan of the well bucket, the creak of the rocking chair where he sat in the evenings with a mug of black coffee cooling in his hand. He had been a husband once, a father once, but the earth had taken both wife and child, and he'd let the silence take him after. It was to this stretch of solitude that two figures came one gray afternoon, the sky holding the threat of early snow. Caleb had been repairing a gate hinge when he heard the crunch of wagon wheels. His rifle leaned against the corral post, as it always did when he worked outside. He straightened, narrowed his eyes, and saw the cart rolling slow, drawn by a weary mule, a woman sitting tall, though plainly worn, and beside her a little girl who clutched the reins as though her small hands could help steady the beast. When the wagon stopped before his yard, the woman climbed down. She was slender, with a plain dress showing the dust of travel, a shawl frayed at the edges, and a trunk lashed in the back. Her face bore no makeup, only the hollow set of someone who had buried her past and carried its weight still. "Mr. Harrow," she said, voice low but steady. "My name is Mara Ellison. This is my daughter, Clara. We've come seeking shelter." Caleb said nothing at first. He took in the mule's rib bones, the scuffed soles of the child's shoes, the way the woman kept her hands, folded tight to still their tremor. He had seen need before, seen it gnaw at men until they turned wolfish. "I've no place for boarders," he said flatly. Mara's eyes flickered, but she did not lower them. "I can work," she answered. "I can cook, mend, tend to stock. I ask no charity, only the chance to earn a corner of your roof until spring." The child, Clara, was perhaps 7 years old. Her eyes were bright despite the dust on her cheeks. Her hair braided neat, though a strand had escaped and curled across her brow. She looked up at Caleb with more courage than was sensible, and something in that gaze made his chest tighten. "Town sent you here?" he asked. "They turned us away," Mara admitted. "Said there's no room, no work for a widow with a child." Caleb's jaw tightened. He had little faith in townsfolk. Their kindness was often just another word for gossip, and their cruelty another word for fear. Still, he had lived alone long enough to know that taking in strangers was a risk. He shook his head once. "Best you move along before the storm catches." At that, the little girl stepped forward. She stood between her mother and the rancher, her small hands fisted at her sides. Her voice came clear without a quiver. "Take me, mister, if you can't take both. I'll help with the horses. Mama can keep going if she has to. But I can. Stay. I don't take up much room." The words fell heavy in the cold air. Mara gasped softly, reaching for her daughter's shoulder, but Clara stood fast, her braids swinging against her back, her eyes locked on Caleb's. Something broke loose inside him then, something he thought long buried beneath years of silence and stone. The memory of another child's voice, another pair of fearless eyes flickered before him like firelight through smoke. His throat worked, but no sound came. Finally, he cleared his voice. "Put your trunk inside." Mara blinked, uncertain she had heard right. When he turned toward the house, she lifted Clara into her arms, holding her close a moment before following. Caleb did not look back, though he felt their presence trailing him like warmth carried into cold rooms. The house was plain, stripped of softness. Bare wood floors, iron stove, table scarred with use, a rocking chair set near the hearth. The only ornament was the rifle above the mantel and a faded quilt folded in the corner. Mara set her trunk by the wall as though careful not to disturb too much. "You may stay," Caleb said, voice rough. "Work as you said. You'll find no coddling here, and when spring comes, you'll move on." Mara nodded once. Relief washed her face, though pride kept her back straight. Clara, still clutching her mother's hand, looked around with wide eyes. That evening, Mara cooked cornbread and beans from what little she carried, and they ate at the scarred table. Clara whispered grace before lifting her spoon, and for the first time in years the house held more than silence at supper. Caleb sat with his coffee cooling before him, watching the girl fight sleep, her head nodding until Mara carried her to the spare cot. When the fire burned low, Caleb settled into his rocking chair. The creak filled the room, mingling with the soft sound of the wind pressing against the windows. He stared at the rifle on the mantel, at the shawl draped across Mara's shoulders as she mended a tear in her daughter's dress, at the trunk that carried the weight of her past. His house had been empty so long that every sound felt foreign, every presence unwelcome. Yet the little girl's words kept echoing. "Take me, mister, if you can't take both." Caleb leaned back, letting the chair's rhythm settle. For the first time in many winters, the silence did not feel quite so large. The days that followed settled like dust on wood, fine and near invisible but impossible not to breathe. The Harrow house, once quiet enough for every board's groan to sound like a shout, now carried the small noises of shared living. The scrape of spoons at the table, the rustle of Clara's bare feet on the floorboards, the hushed voice of Mara humming as she worked. Caleb bore it all with the stiff patience of a man who had long trained himself to expect nothing but silence. His house had been stripped bare of softness. Even the curtains had been taken down, years ago. For what use was fabric meant to warm a window when no one stood beside him to admire it? The hearth had burned through countless winters without a shawl hung near it, without a child's toy left scattered on the floor. Now each of those absences pressed against the new presences that filled them. Mara had brought little with her, yet even her few belongings unsettled him. Chief among them was the trunk she placed by the wall in the spare room. She never opened it where he could see, but Caleb knew what lay folded within, a wedding dress, yellowed with age but carefully kept. When she lifted it once to shake the creases, he'd turned sharply away as though the sight of white cloth might blind him. She carried it like a tether, not to the man she had lost, but to the vows she could not forget. She still wore her hair in long braids, never unfastened. At night, as if undoing them might unravel her altogether. He saw her fingers trace them absently when she thought herself alone, and he knew then that grief had ways of binding tighter than rope. The ranch itself bore scars no less permanent. Fence posts leaned like weary old men, their wire rusting at the ends. Tools hung in the barn, handles worn smooth from hands now long gone. Even the rocking chair in the corner bore grooves in its arms where Caleb's fingers had rested through endless nights. Above the mantel, the rifle kept its watch. Polished though it hadn't fired in months, it was less a weapon now than a reminder of what had been taken, of what could come again. Clara, untouched by those ghosts, wandered the ranch with wide-eyed wonder. She touched everything, asked after everything. Why does the pump squeak? That way? Did the tree always lean so? What's behind that hill? Caleb rarely answered. His silence frustrated her, but she kept trying as if her persistence might carve a channel through stone. It was Mara who began to learn more. She asked no direct questions, only listened when fragments slipped free from his guarded tongue. She pieced together his story as though it were a quilt made of scattered cloth. A wife lost to fever one summer, a boy of 10 buried in the orchard soil before his time. Each grave dug with his own hands, each prayer left unsaid because he had no breath for words. She understood then the hardness of his jaw, the weight in his eyes. He was a man who had buried too much and spoken too little. Still, the outside world did not forget them. Whispers carried from town, riding on the backs of peddlers and neighbors. Some said Mara's kin had been too friendly with natives during the last skirmish, had offered food or shelter when blood was still hot between settlers and tribes. Others claimed her late husband had owed debts best left unpaid. Trust ran thin, and suspicion found new fuel in her presence at Caleb's ranch. One afternoon, a rider from the neighboring spread passed through, a man with a voice sharpened by cruelty. He leaned in his saddle and spat words that stung like burrs, that Mara's people had betrayed their own, that she was a curse on any home fool enough to harbor her. Caleb had been standing by the corral, hands steady on a rail. He said nothing, gave no sign of either anger or defense. His silence was mistaken for agreement. Mara's face went pale, and when the rider left, she turned back toward the house with a look Caleb could not name but had felt himself. Rejection so sharp it left no breath in the lungs. That night, she nearly packed the trunk. Her hands lingered over the folded dress, over Clara's sleeping form, her shawl draped heavy around her shoulders. To stay was to risk another wound. To leave was to walk again into a world that had already turned its back. Rain fell against the roof in thin silver streaks. Caleb sat in his chair by the fire, the lamplight painting hollows on his face. Mara moved in the doorway, half in shadow. He saw her then, saw the way her shoulders sagged, the way her hands clutched the shawl as if to keep from coming apart. His voice broke the hush, softer than she had ever heard it. Folks say much when they're empty of truth. The words drifted, like smoke, but they filled the room. Mara stilled, the air caught in her chest. It was not an apology, nor a promise, but it was enough. For the first time since she had stepped onto his land, she felt less a burden, more a soul allowed to remain. Clara stirred in her sleep and murmured something dream-born. Mara brushed her daughter's hair back, her fingers gentle. She lifted, her eyes once more to Caleb, and though no thanks crossed her lips, he read it in her gaze. The rain kept falling, steady as breath. Inside, the silence shifted, not gone, but changed. It no longer pressed so heavily against them. It bent slightly, toward something else, something not yet named but possible. The first snow came sudden, fierce as if the sky itself had broken open. By nightfall, the plains lay buried beneath drifts that swallowed fences and pressed against the barn doors. Wind shrieked around the eaves of the ranch house, rattling, shutters and hurling needles of ice against the windows. The stove glowed red, and the three of them huddled close, each with their own silence. It was deep into that storm when the knock came. At first, Caleb thought it only the wind, a branch, striking the wall. But then came another, louder, uneven, a sound no storm could make. He rose from his chair, hand brushing the rifle by the door. Mara's eyes met his, wide but steady. Clara stirred from where she lay curled on a quilt, whispering, "Mama?" Caleb unlatched the door and the storm roared in, cold slashing through the room. A man fell across the threshold, snow crusting his hair, blood dark on his sleeve. His skin was bronze, his braids stiff with ice, his breath shallow as if each one might be his last. Caleb froze. Every memory of raids, of smoke rising from cabins, of bodies left broken on fields, flooding back like an old wound split open. He gripped the rifle tighter, but Mara moved first. Without a word, she knelt beside the man, dragging him in from the snow. "Shut the door," she ordered, voice sharp as a command, not a plea. Caleb obeyed, though his jaw clenched. He watched as Mara stripped away the man's frozen coat, revealing the jagged wound beneath. Her hands worked quick, steady, the hands of someone who had faced death too many times to flinch at its nearness. She cleaned the blood with rags, wrapped the arm in strips torn from her own petticoat, and pressed her shawl across his chest for warmth. The man's eyes fluttered open, dark and watchful even in weakness. He spoke a word Caleb did not know, soft as breath. Mara hushed him, pressing a finger to his lips. "Rest," she said. For 3 days the storm held them captive. Snow climbed the windows and the wind howled as though the earth itself wished to shake the house apart. Inside, the stranger lay on a cot, his breaths ragged but steadying under Mara's care. His name, when at last he spoke it, was Chaitin. He offered no tale of how he had come to be wounded in the storm, and Mara did not ask. She moved about him, with a quiet reverence as if his presence were no more strange than a sparrow fallen against the window. Clara, unafraid, watched him with wide eyes. She showed him her doll, braided its yarn hair than her own. Chaitin smiled faintly and with a word or two taught her names in his tongue. She repeated them, stumbling over the sounds, laughing when he gently corrected her. The firelight flickered, on their faces on the feathered braid that lay across his shoulder. Caleb kept his distance. Every set of his shoulders showed his unease. He tended to the stove, chopped wood with more force than needed, checked the rifle though no danger pressed, against their door. Yet his eyes never left the stranger for long. He measured each glance, each word, weighing trust against memory. One evening when Clara slept with her doll clasped tight, Mara spoke softly across the room. Once, settlers came across this land seeking mercy. We were strangers then, too. Caleb's jaw tightened. And not all strangers meant peace. No, Mara admitted. Her voice was steady, but her hand trembled as it smoothed Clara's braid. But kindness offered is never wasted. It keeps us human, Caleb, even when the world tries to turn us otherwise. Her words lingered, as steady as the lamplight burning between them. Caleb said nothing, but the silence after was not as sharp as before. By the fourth day, the storm broke. The sky cleared to a glassy blue, and sunlight struck the snow until it glittered like crushed stars. Chaitin rose, his wound bound, his strength slow but returning. He dressed in the garments that had dried by the fire, each movement deliberate, dignified. At the hearth he paused. He reached into the braid at his shoulder and drew out an eagle feather, its edges worn smooth by years of care. He set it on the stone by the fire, bowing his head once before lifting his gaze to Caleb. No words passed between them, only the weight of something offered, something accepted or refused in silence. Chaitin stepped into the snow and was gone, his tracks leading toward the horizon until the glare swallowed them. Caleb stood long at the hearth that night. The rifle leaned in its usual place, silent sentinel, but his eyes rested instead on the feather. It was a simple thing, light as air, fragile as any scrap of down, yet it bore a weight greater than iron. He thought of the storm, of the knock at the door, of Mara's hands steady over blood. He thought of Clara's laughter at foreign words, of the warmth that had lingered even while snow pressed against the walls. He thought of the silence he had once carried as armor, and how it had shifted if only by a hair's breadth. The fire crackled low and Caleb sat in his rocking chair, staring at the feather. His heart, scarred and quiet for so long, felt the stirrings of something he did not yet name. It was not trust, not forgiveness, but it was not hatred either. It was the space in between, fragile as snow and just as fleeting if one did not choose to guard it. Winter clung to the plains long past its welcome. Snow hardened into crust, ice glazed the water troughs, and the wind carried a knife's edge even on days when the sun showed its face. The ranch became a crucible where silence, work, and weariness forged something brittle between those who lived under the same roof. Caleb rose before light as always, but he was not the only figure at the barn anymore. Clara followed him, bundled in an oversized coat that swallowed her thin arms. She trailed after him with questions, and though his answers were spare, he began to show her things. How to brush a horse's coat until it gleamed, how to check, hooves for stones, how to move slow so as not to spook them. His voice softened when he explained, his hands patient as they guided hers. Mara watched from the doorway one morning, shawl drawn close, and the sight unsettled her. For years, she had learned not to trust the kindness of men. It often bent toward cruelty once the mask slipped. She feared that whatever gentleness stirred in Caleb might crack, leaving her daughter with another scar she could not mend. That fear grew one evening when she found him by the fire, a lamp lit low at his elbow, Clara's ragged doll lay across his lap, its arm torn loose after too much play. Caleb held a needle between his scarred fingers, stitching the cloth with the same steady care he once gave his rifle. His brow furrowed in concentration, yet his hands were tender. Mara stood in the doorway unseen, her heart pulled taut between distrust and a fragile hope she did not dare name. But outside their walls, the world's judgment crept closer. A rider from a neighboring ranch brought supplies one afternoon, stamping snow from his boots as he entered the barn where Caleb worked. He leaned against a post, voice heavy with suspicion. "That Lakota fella you sheltered? Word is he was part of a raiding party last season. Folks don't forget that sort of thing, nor do they forgive someone who keeps his company." Caleb kept his hand steady on the harness he was mending, but his silence was read as agreement. The rider pressed harder. "You got that widow and her girl here too. Not everyone takes kindly to it. Sooner or later you'll pay the price. Cattle gone, fences cut, maybe worse. A man's reputation keeps him alive out here. Best not to ruin yours for the sake of strays." When the rider left, Caleb stood alone in the barn, the weight of the words sinking deep. He had built his life on solitude, on the hard-earned respect of neighbors who trusted him to keep his land and keep to himself. To lose that standing was to risk everything. Yet he thought of Mara's shawl across her shoulders, of Clara's braid slipping loose as she worked the brush through the horse's mane. He did not know if he could send them away. Mara overheard enough to know the shape of the threat. Her hands shook as she folded laundry, the sting of rejection tightening around her chest. She had been turned away from doors before, had watched faces shudder at the sight of her and her child. To hear it again, this time directed at the roof that sheltered her, was almost more than she could bear. That night, the house filled with silence thicker than any storm. Caleb sat in his rocking chair, the firelight deepening the lines of his face. Mara moved about the room, shawl drawn tight, words crowding her throat yet refusing to be spoken. She thought of leaving, of taking Clara by the hand and braving the cold rather than waiting for Caleb's silence to harden into dismissal. But each time she gathered courage, she faltered at the sight of her daughter asleep by the hearth, safe for once, untroubled in dreams. The wind rattled the windows, moaning like a voice that would not be stilled. Caleb rocked slow, his gaze fixed on the flames. He could feel Mara's eyes on him, feel the weight of her question unspoken. "Will you cast us out too?" Clara stirred, then rose from her quilt. Sleep heavy, she crossed the room and nestled against Caleb's side without hesitation, her small head resting on his arm. For the first time in years, he did not move away. His hand, rough and scarred, lifted and settled lightly on her braid. Mara watched, her breath caught. She had braced herself for rejection, for silence sharpened into dismissal. Instead, she saw something else. A man weary with loneliness, yet slowly remembering how to bear the warmth of others. The fire cracked, the rocking chair groaned. Outside, the wind kept howling. But within those walls, a fragile thread stretched between them, woven not by words but by presence. Trust and doubt danced in equal measure, yet for that night, neither claimed victory. The thaw came slow, hesitant, as though winter itself was unwilling to release its grip. Snow shrank back from the fence lines, turning to water that soaked into the earth and left mud heavy beneath every step. Ice cracked loose from the troughs, floating like shards of glass on the surface. The air smelled of damp wood and thawing soil, a season in between, fragile and uncertain. But with the thaw came danger. It was Clara who first noticed the cattle missing from the far pasture. She had gone with Caleb to count the herd, her braid swinging as she tried to mimic his way of marking heads with her eyes. Only the numbers did not match. Several head were gone. The ground near the creek churned with boot prints instead of hooves. Caleb felt the old heat rise in his chest. He saddled his horse in silence, jaw set, rifle strapped to the saddle. Mara tried to stop him with nothing more than a hand on his arm, but he shook his head. "They'll not take more," he said, and rode into the gray morning. The trail was easy to follow, too easy as though the thieves had little fear of being pursued. He found them near the ridge, 4 men from town, faces he half knew. Their clothes were ragged, their voices bitter with the old poison of grief and blame. "Cattle to feed our own," one shouted. "Why should you keep them when you shelter the likes of her?" Her kin sided with the ones who burned us out. Blood still fresh for some of us. Caleb did not argue. He raised his rifle and fired once into the air, the sound cracking across the ridge like thunder. "Leave what's mine," he said, voice flat, calm but unyielding. They cursed him, spat words meant to wound deeper than bullets. Then one lunged forward with a rusted blade, and the scuffle broke. Caleb drove them off, but not before the knife caught his side, opening flesh beneath his coat. He stayed in the saddle long enough to watch them scatter, the cattle driven back toward his land, before the strength bled out of him. By the time he reached the house, his shirt was dark with blood. Mara's cry cut the air sharp as a hawk's. He fell from the saddle, staggered through the door, and collapsed by the hearth where fire still burned low. Mara was on her knees beside him in an instant, pulling at his coat, pressing her shawl against the wound. Her hands trembled, but they did not falter. Tears spilled freely, ones she had held behind walls for too many months. "You should not have stood for us," she whispered, voice breaking. Caleb's breath came ragged, his jaw tight with pain. There was no one else who would, he forced through clenched teeth. The words hung between them, heavier than blood, heavier than silence. Mara pressed harder against the wound, her shawl darkening, her tears falling onto the cloth as if trying to wash the hurt away. The days that followed blurred into nights of fever and fitful rest. Caleb lay on the cot, pale and sweating, while Mara tended him with ceaseless care. She changed bandages, brewed bitter teas, bathed his brow with cool water. Clara sat nearby with her doll, wide-eyed but quiet, as though her small presence might guard him from slipping further. In those long hours, walls began to crack. Caleb spoke of his boy, of the orchard grave, of how he'd dug until his hands bled because the ground was frozen. He told of his wife's fever, of the nights he'd prayed without words, only the rocking chair's groan keeping him upright. Mara listened, her own stories spilling in return, of a marriage begun with promise and ended with debts, of whispers that painted her kin as traitors, of doors slammed and voices turned hard when she begged for work. She spoke of carrying Clara across miles of road, her shawl the only shield between her child and the cold. Their silences grew softer. They were no longer walls, but pauses where breath steadied, where grief found room to ease its weight. One evening, the fever broke, leaving Caleb weak but clearer-eyed. Mara sat by the fire, her needle mending Clara's dress. The lamplight caught the strands of her hair, and for the first time since she had arrived, her braid was undone. It spilled loose over her shoulders, dark and shining, a quiet gesture of trust. Caleb, watching from the cot, felt something shift inside him. His solitude, long a shield, seemed suddenly like a chain he had dragged through years of silence. He saw her there, shawl slipping from her shoulders, braid undone, face softened by firelight, and he knew that survival alone was not the same as living. Clara slept nearby, her doll clasped tight, the fire's glow painting her face in peace. The house, once stripped of all softness, now carried it in abundance, in the warmth of shawl and braid, in the sound of breath not his own, in the quiet presence of those who stayed. Caleb closed his eyes, not in retreat, but in surrender. He let the weight of solitude slip, if only for a night, and felt the slow burn of something steadier than fire, something that might last beyond the thaw. The thaw had loosened the land, but not the men who carried grudges like rusted chains. It was near sundown when they came again, 4 riders, the same who had stolen cattle and left Caleb bleeding. Their horses kicked up mud, their faces gaunt, with bitterness. They rode to the porch, voices sharp with the kind of anger that grows when sorrow festers. "Send her off, Harrow," one shouted, his eyes narrow on Mara where she stood in the doorway. "She's a curse on your ground. Bad blood follows her. Folk won't trade with you, won't ride for you. You keep her, you'll lose it all." Caleb, weak still from his wound, stepped forward. His rifle rested in his hand, but he did not raise it. The porch boards groaned under his weight, his breath short, but his gaze was steady. "This house is mine," he said, voice rough as gravel. "And who stays beneath its roof is mine to say. You'll not make that choice for me." Dope. Men jeered. One spat into the dirt. Another set his hand on the butt of his pistol. The air between them trembled, heavy with the memory of every raid, every grave dug, every whispered lie carried on the wind. Before the moment could break, shapes moved at the edge of the field. Riders, 6, maybe more, slipped from the trees, silent as the dusk itself. Their ponies padded over the softening earth, their presence still but undeniable. Chayton rode at the front, his dark hair bound, his eyes clear. He dismounted without a word, standing tall in the failing light. His kin followed, quiet but firm. No weapons drawn, only presence. Chayton's gaze met Caleb's, then turned to Mara. "When fever took my child," he said in a voice strong enough for all to hear, "it was she who stayed. She carried water. She cooled his brow. She prayed in her tongue when ours had no words left." The mob faltered. Their anger, sharp and jagged, found no footing against such calm truth. The man with his hand on the pistol let it fall away. The others shifted uneasily in their saddles, muttering. One cursed under his breath, but none met Chayton's gaze. "Mercy was given here," Chayton said, still calm. "Mercy binds stronger than blood. If you cannot see that, then you are the ones cursed." Silence followed, broken only by the wind in the budding trees. At last the riders turned, spurred their horses, and vanished down the road, their bitterness scattering like chaff. The porch grew quiet again. Caleb lowered his rifle, leaning on it more for balance than threat. Mara stood beside him, shawl drawn close, her face pale but unbroken. Clara peered from behind the doorway, braiding her doll's hair with tiny, careful fingers, as though the world had not just teetered on the edge of violence. Chayton gave a nod. Neither triumph nor farewell, only respect. Then he and his kin slipped away as quietly as they had come, leaving behind the echo of their solidarity. The storm had passed. What lingered was silence, heavy and thick with relief. Caleb sank into the rocking chair, the wood creaking beneath him. Mara stepped onto the porch, standing near though she did not touch him. Together they watched the last of the snow melt into muddy spring, the land breathing again after long frost. The shawl hung drying by the fire, the rifle leaned in the corner, and Clara's humming carried softly from within. Life would not be easy. Land still needed mending, cattle still needed guarding, and whispers in town would not quiet overnight. But the house no longer felt hollow. It carried warmth now, not in riches but in the shawl on the peg, the rocking chair that no longer groaned alone, the laughter of a child who felt safe enough to hum. Weeks later, they rode into town. The wagon wheels clattered over the thawed ruts, the horses snorting in the cool spring air. Caleb held the reins, his side healed though still stiff, his hat low against the sun. Mara sat tall beside him, her shawl drawn close, her gaze steady despite the stares that followed. Clara perched between them, humming softly, her doll tucked in her lap. The whispers still ran, low, biting, persistent, but they no longer cut as they once had. Caleb did not turn to hear them, and Mara did not bow her head. She sat straight, as one who had been weighed and found worthy, not by the town's judgment but by the quiet dignity of survival. When their business was done, they turned the wagon homeward. The road stretched long, lined with budding cottonwoods, the air alive with the scent of damp earth and green shoots pushing through. Caleb's hands were steady on the reins, the horses eager for the familiar path. Behind them, the town shrank into the distance, its whispers carried away by wind. Before them lay the ranch, scarred but standing, waiting with its porch and rocking chair, with its hearth and shawl, with its promise of work and silence shared. Caleb glanced once at Mara. She met his eyes without flinching. No words passed, for none were needed. Between them the silence was no longer emptiness but bond, The rancher who had sworn never to love again now carried two souls beside him, not as burden, but as promise. The road stretched on, and together they rode it home.